On this episode of the podcast, I have with me Rohit Parchuri. He is the CISO at Yext. We're going to be talking about the different functions in the security ecosystem, different roles, different involvement, how the reporting structure works, interaction with other stakeholders. And top it all off, the CISO and the security function is pretty new. We're going to talk to Rohit about all this stuff. Thanks for being on the podcast.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Awesome. Let's start off with two quick things. One, tell everyone what Yext does. And I know you're the CISO, but just let everyone know what some of your responsibilities entail.
Yeah, for sure. Let me start off with the company and the things that we do. So Yext is basically an answers platform. So in other words, we're a searching and a listings portfolio company. So what Google search basically does for consumers like you and me, we do that to the enterprise businesses and clients thereof. So we do have different product lines. Of course, everything branch off into something called a knowledge platform, which is where we collect the business facts, such as locations data, your timing, your work hours, etc., for a business, and then we disseminate that elsewhere into the products that I just spoke about. So from my role standpoint, I am responsible for basically all things security. This means all the way from IT and enterprise security, zero trust, data protection, application, product, and cloud security, and also audit, field security, and third-party risk also falls into my realm. We do have a pretty great team that works for the CISO office, and we're pretty proud of things that we do, protecting the company, and also defining how exactly we need to think about the security function as we mature out. So, yeah, that's me and my team.
There we go. I guess let's a good starting point is I know you had mentioned obviously the CISO title is pretty new. I went and Googled it, but maybe give us a little insight in terms of how new it is and kind of how it's grown over the last decade or so.
Yeah, for sure. So this actually came as a surprise for me. I didn't know that CISO title was so new, but it's it makes sense if you think about how it's been evolving and how young the industry itself has been, youngest like cybersecurity industry has been. I think I caught the statement somewhere in one of the podcasts, and one speaker was talking about it was only in '95 when we actually had a new security executive title, which happens to be CISO. And now, of course, it has taken different shapes and forms, but we'll talk about that more. But I think this began in '95. I think Citigroup was the first company that actually introduced this. The intent was to have this title respond to maintaining security of information and operations, information systems and operations, within the company, right, within the internal technology infrastructure. So not really talking about the product or the applications that the company builds and provides this to the customers, but it's more so that internally they wanted to have some kind of a policy and person who can actually handle and process that info. So we're protecting the employees and also the systems thereof. So that's where it began, right? So I think over the past 25-ish years, it's taken multiple different forms. And I think one of the significant changes that we've seen in the recent past, I would say like in last 10 years, is that it kind of morphed from this internal only defense to outward defense, which is building product security teams or making sure you have the right elements, right checks and balances within your application security and cloud security. And cloud is a new term, as you can imagine, but it still goes back into the products and digital offerings that you build for your customers. So I think it just felt it felt that CISO was kind of doing these things internally. Like, why not have the same responsibility, which is also outwardly focused? I think even in the recent past, of course, I think you see a lot of cloud transformation that's going on, and it's no exception for security professionals to also go into that realm because, as much as there's compute and storage and processing of information, there also needs to have some layer of defense. And I think that's exactly where, cybersecurity comes into play. That is one of the things that also CISOs are responsible for right now. And also one thing I would also point out, and we typically see this in some big companies, like mostly on the heavily regulated side, where CISOs are also responsible for physical security facilities, just given how much paper, how much physical products also exist. And for example, healthcare is a good example of that, right? So you have HIPAA, which talks about the protection of your healthcare data, irrespective of it's digital or on paper. And as you can imagine, there are a lot of antiquated processes still happening within healthcare entities, which means there's a lot of paper. And this is physical paper. So protection of that also comes under, CISO. So technically that part also morphs into that.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually really some great points, and maybe we'll unpack a few of those. The one thing you mentioned, obviously, is the cloud and the emergence and the need for security to be integrated and viewed within the cloud perspective. And they also mentioned some things, HIPAA, that are process related. Security is interesting in the sense that there's both a technical component where you can be super, super technical, and then also you can just be very much functional process driven type roles. And it's this breadth. I mean, I'm sure there's multiple hats different teams wears, but there's a lot of different, components and functions within security. As you're kind of, looking at the team, and when you look to set up a team, as you've seen this growth in cloud and cloud security, and then you have the process side, how have you been kind of working with, building out your team to address both those, different types of functions?
It's a very interesting question. And I'm, going to say this in two different ways. I think it really depends on where in the industry you're located and what kind of maturity do you have within the company even before you arrive. Like I'm talking more from a CISO standpoint, right? If you're arriving to a company that is pretty mature in how the program is being operated, then you kind of take a different approach versus if you're starting everything from the scratch. Well, for me, my principle in kind of setting this team up is very simple, right? I'll give credit to Phil Venables about this topic. Phil Venables is a CISO for Google Cloud, and he talked about in one of those articles, and this is where I kind of got this impression, and I kind of modified that to my use case. Is there are three critical components of a security team, especially when you're trying to build the program out. One is the risk advisors. Advisors themselves are people who are actually trying to push the message out, have a common narrative, talking to people, build these relationships, collaborate on the projects, etc. But everything comes from a security standpoint. These folks could be as simple as audit, internal audit, or just program managers for building out certain security projects. This could be a contractual thing or a regulatory thing, but we're having these people to actually push the project forward. And then we have SMEs or subject matter experts, right? So these are the folks that actually go mile deep, and it's very niche in how their role came about. These are the folks that do threat hunting or are very specific on the forensics within the incident response realm, or even architects, security architects. There's been a concept of software architects for a long time, but security architects is fairly new term. The market is still catching up to, but there's an element of why there's a need for architecture within the security products, because everything is kind of being blended into our product infrastructure. And so there is a need to have some thought leadership go into how the architecture and design has to happen with the security systems and how they kind of integrate with our existing ecosystems. This could mean product ecosystem or developer ecosystem, whatnot. And then we have the operational analysts who keep the doors open, who make sure that we're sustaining a certain project, we're sustaining a certain discipline from going, right? So these could mean like security operations analysts or security support or security administrators, data admins. Really, the maintenance and upkeep of the security program is really handled by these operational analysts. So I feel like for me that has been the philosophy that I work with, and it's been successful. Like in my past two gigs, I've been pretty successful with having a good diversity within these three realms, and then using that to actually build out the teams. And also don't make a mistake of these being teams themselves. These are just disciplines, and every team should ideally have some component of these three disciplines to make it operational, to make it something which is more significant in terms of how you build the maturity around that.
And I guess it's you had touched on security architect. Specifically if you're looking at cloud security, obviously each each platform has its own nuances, has its own complexity. When you view cloud security, and obviously, we could maybe just use, Yext as an example, or you can look at a previous, maybe company, but that role, does it sit within, more of the security team, or is that part of more of the, architecture or the technical team, and things are matrix? Because that seems to me very much art, not science, because you could easily see it's somebody in your team. I could easily see it's somebody maybe sitting under the infrastructure, or the whoever's responsible for DevOps or SRE. I mean, or any other team really. It seems like a very tricky role as to where that function would sit.
So it comes with a lot of solid lines and dotted lines. That much I can say, right? It's like you said. I think you put it very right about the matrix, about how we think about these. It's no exception to Yext as well. We think about those in the same way. Yext is an SMB, right? We're about 1,500-ish employees. So we've been a public company, so there are certain things we need to meet in that realm. But at the same time, security is more like a startup within kind of an established company. And, just 1 year ago, we were 2 people or 3 people, including myself. Now we're 17 people, which is pretty good size. But still, if you think about the maturity, the operations, the governance around how we deploy and detect certain things, that still, is something we need to improve on. So with all that in mind, it's in one way, it's a good thing, because we're trying to build the fundamental blocks before we can think about the skyscraper. So we're starting from the scratch and going up, which actually gives us the opportunity to interact and also collaborate with our data and software architects more, and how we need to think about the cloud approach and how we need to tie that back into security disciplines. So right now, the way it stands, it's a function of security. We are still a lean team, right? But that doesn't mean we're not looking at the architecture and the design elements on how these things fit in. But there's a pretty heavy collaboration and partnership with the development and infrastructure teams on how we can make that happen. And the way we do this is more from a strategic architecture layout of the product rather than taking it from security. So the way we think about security is, of course, it has to align with the business and the business goals thereof, but not the other way around. So we think about that from that sense, and we get the requirements first, and then we try to build this out. And ideally, I think what was successful is to really have a task force as opposed to a single person being responsible for that. And task force could mean that we have representation from different teams like SRE, infrastructure, product, engineering, and security, of course. And then we put our heads together and figure out, okay, this is the right approach, and this is actually going to self-sustain itself as we go into it. But thinking about those elements, I think, has been really successful.
Yeah, actually, I mean, those are some great points. And as I'm kind of listening to you, and I think you mentioned, the history of the CISO, and it was more internal facing. You even talked about the physical security sometimes being responsible. We hear a lot about the human element, right? I think there's a big percentage of security issues come from humans, but the more I interview CISOs, the more I talk to, just listening to you even speak, I hear this technical element. It almost seems like there's there's almost two sides of the role, where it's this human element that still exists, the security champion, the advocate, but then this technical element's emerging because of the complexity of cloud, and it's not behind your fenced wall that you're protecting anymore. And it seems like this split is kind of forcing like a development of a technical aptitude that is kind of accelerating. I guess when you're kind of looking at that, hey, I need to be worried about the human element, the functions to support that. Then now you're talking about these solid lines, these dotted lines, or the technical element. I mean, I don't think you could pick and choose which kid you want to save, but as you're kind of viewing each one developing, the technical element, is it something that you're realizing is progressing technically and forcing the team to kind of, keep evolving that technical skill set versus the human elements, a little bit more stable? Is that fair, or is that completely nonsensical?
I don't think it's nonsensical. I think it's a good question to ask. And I think, I don't really have a great answer here. I'm going to say that outright. I think, most of the people don't. It's because it's a reality of the world that we live in, on how fast the transformation is happening and how fast we have to wrap our heads around the technology, and how soon that's also increasing exponentially, right? You have a tech today that that talks with a certain library. Tomorrow, the same tech talks with a completely separate library, which comes with its own practices and disciplines. So I think it's evolving. Is continuous improvement is something that we all have to do, irrespective of if you're in security or not. But I think what has helped me think about this is more so that we talk about the human element. I think human element is never going to go away. It's everything that starts with a human and ends with a human. Human is the center of the universe, like everything else that we do in the industry. And when we think about that, we think about the users. Their goal is not security. My goal is security. Like I should not make them accountable for security. They have their own job. They have their own things to deal with. I don't want to put the burden on them to think about these things. Rather, I want to turn the table around and have thought leadership within my team to think about how can we set up the right guardrails. Like there's this thing called the trust but verify discipline that's been going around. It's a good intent. I'm just not sure how practical it really is. And so for me, it's been like, let's set up the guardrails, the right guardrails, the secure defaults. Like in case we need something to establish, let's not actually rely on the training and education we provide to the users. That's going to be complementary knowledge. But the technical aspects of things, or the way that we're trying to structure the control, has to be something that even if the user carries out a mistake, it's not something that's going to disrupt the business in any way. So that's philosophy and methodology that we're implementing on that side of things, right? Technology comes into that too, in a way that I think the SME concept that I spoke about, the subject matter experts, is exactly for that reason. I think if we have the right diversity in place, if the person, like the SME that we're actually hiring, if he or she has that comprehensive disciplinary that comes from a foundational knowledge about how things work predominantly, I think that itself is going to take care of a lot of things. I think everything, typically I say this, like we stand on the shoulder of the giants, right? So it's like we have this, amazing architectures and amazing products already. All we're trying to figure out is the shapes and forms of each of them and how we're trying to build different components on top of them. So if you really understand the foundations of that, I think it's easy for us to kind of pivot and adapt as the situations arise, as the tech comes about. But that, of course, that also means that we need to have the continuous education in place for our people. And that's something, I prioritize, the company prioritizes. So, that's one way for us to, keep things going. But I would definitely not worry too much about, the continuous emergence of technologies and if that's going to affect us. I think we should definitely stay ahead of that principle, and we just need to think about, how comprehensive we can think about the skill set problems and how can we, embed that into our roles existing right now.
I guess as you've been kind of, if you look past in the last past decade, half decade, and compared to now, are you seeing security needing a more technical skill set because of the growth in the tools, the infrastructures, the complexity? It's no longer a set defined tools. If you come in and you do half the job, and with all these roles, you mentioned security architect, which is in and of itself a new term. Is the upskilling side, when you're looking at your teams and trying to make sure everyone's career is advancing and working on other things, the upskilling component has to be something I'd imagine that's critical, because you just said it's rapidly spinning up.
Yeah, for sure. Oh my God, there's no doubt about the upskilling. There's no doubt about security being more technical advisory than not. I think that we've seen that. We've seen that in the past few years, and how deep we need to get into the technology to really understand the branches and the fundamentals of that before we can build something. Like we need to know something in and out before we can build a control around it, right? This is no different than an asset management. We need to know if something existed before we can protect it. I think the technology is, I think in one way it's helping also, like, because if you see the cyber emergence that's happening, like where we see a proliferation of services and cyber tools that are actually coming about. And in some case, we're able to leverage them to actually use the skill of the tool, of the solution, rather than just, having a person go through that. I think there's an element of that also, tech helping tech out. But the cross training is something, we also plan to do. We don't do it right now, but we also plan to do is that I think, having a collective repository of knowledge would be more helpful than actually having a single person do that. that is something we just have to, I think that's a muscle that we all have to build. Especially as security teams always have leaner teams. Like, we don't really have unlimited resources. I'm not saying any other team or any other discipline has, but security specifically, I think we just have to prove the things that we're doing, forecast the risk better, and with that comes a truly high amount of burden that actually falls under the people. That continuous involvement, continuous improvement, things like that. So I think collectively thinking about the problems, collectively thinking about the tech, and making sure we do have the right way of approaching them. This could mean through, instructions. This could mean through playbooks. This could mean, through processes, etc. I think we just have to have a healthy balance between the tech that we could leverage to actually get some of these taken care of. On the other side, like, of course, we should have a collection of individuals, putting their thoughts together and put something in place so that, new people or existing people are able to easily cross-train and make that, a possible reality as we go through, thinking about upskilling, etc.
Yeah, and you mentioned leaner budgets, which is interesting because I've heard it a couple times. It's actually maybe more than a couple times. And if I'm outside of the security world looking in, I assume as much as you hear about security, and obviously it's always in the news. We're hearing about ransomware, all this stuff. I just would assume big budgets. Throw tons of money at it. It doesn't seem that just chucking a ton of money is always the solution. Hence, you mentioned leaner budgets, and it's there's so much to defend. It's a question of where do you allocate that budget? When you look at leaner budgets and you're looking at your team and the growth, like when you're kind of forecasting out like the needs of the team and you see these emerging areas, like, is your roadmap like, hey, I know I'm going to need budget down the road because this in of itself is growing complexity that I need to keep my eye on?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question. I think budget is always a very, very tricky concept onto itself. And cybersecurity plays within the budget is going to be even more trickier because it's not the I keep hearing about this, like, how do you define the ROI for security? I don't think there is one. I think it's going to be really, really difficult for us to define ROI and also make quantitative advancements towards defining what an ROI is. In my personal opinion, I don't think we should focus on the ROI, but we should focus on the outcomes of what exactly we're trying to accomplish. And one of the things that we do within Yext is this program called security risk modeling. Is almost similar to the technology risk register or the enterprise risk register, etc., but it has much more technical elements to it. One of the biggest factors we look at is the company direction in terms of market verticals that we're trying to approach, or we're just trying to approach a different demographic in our client landscape, and do we need to think about those things? So when we like I said before, security has to align with the business, not the other way around. So I think everything starts with the business, and we have a list of goals that we need to accomplish for the next fiscal. And that helps us kind of drive it down and figure out what's the risk or the attack surface that we're concerned about. And then we would objectively measure the risk that we do have, and what kind of tech, what kind of process do we need to put in? And of course, what kind of people do we need to hire, or can we, capitalize on our existing usage of people and heads? That would ultimately become the part of the envelope that we're trying to push for. There's already enough tech. So one thing I'm very, very considerate about the overlap between the tech, right? I think that is going to cause more harm than good, because we still have to manage the tools, right? Just because it's a security tool, it's not inherently security conscious. It could not be. Right, I think that's the overhead. I'm not willing in investing unless we do find the niche that, okay, this does what it's exactly supposed to, and this directly relates back into the risk that we're trying to manage. And of course, the risk discussion has to, look at or has to align with the tech or the process or people investment we're making. And more importantly, it has to showcase the outcome, which is what I was talking about. Focus on the outcomes. If there's an outcome, and this is something based on the direction we're taking as a company, let's go for it. So that's typically how I think about it.
Yeah, I think that's actually a great answer to the question. And I like how you mentioned focus on the outcomes, because the ROI is hard to define. I was going to say thanks I know time is tight. I appreciate you making the time to be on. I'm cognizant of our time. So I was going to ask you a couple final questions before I let you go. I guess the question I'd like to ask guests is if they had an opportunity to ask a future guest to speak to a specific topic or answer one question, what you would like that to be.
Well, since we just spoke about ROI, I would really like to get more information about, or how other CISOs or leaders approach this, is how do we quantify risk? What are the factors that go into risk quantification, and how specific and granular do we actually get? And who do you think would be the consumers of that info? And is that actually going to feed back into the program or the things that you're building out? I myself had thought through about this and talked about the topic with multiple other CISOs, but I'm yet to get a proper response on that. So I'm just going to throw that out there.
Awesome. I might actually turn that into a roundtable and see if I can grab a few people, maybe you include it, and see if we can have a few people talk about that topic. I think it'd be really interesting. And then if somebody does want to reach out to you to pick your brain on anything you said on the podcast or just in general, what's a good way of getting in touch? LinkedIn, social, email?
LinkedIn is the best, and I can put my email also down, but LinkedIn is the best. So you can find me at Rohit Parchuri. Of course, search for Rohit Parchuri. I'll pop up, and I'm, like I said, I'm the CISO for Yext, and you should be able to find me there. But I'll share my email address too.
Okay, awesome. We'll make sure to put the LinkedIn in the show notes so everyone can find it. Thanks for being on again. I thought this was an awesome discussion. Great insights.
Yeah, thanks for listening, and thanks, Amir. This is really good.
Awesome. That's it for this episode. We'll be back again, different topic, different guests. Until then, two things. One, I might turn Rohit's question into a roundtable. I think that ROI in security question is compelling. I think it could lead to great discussion. So if you want to be a part of that, reach out to me, let me know. Secondly, if you like the podcast, if you enjoyed the podcast, one of two things is great. Share it with someone else, or give the podcast a solid review on whatever platform you're listening to. That's how we've been growing. But that's it for now. Thank you and goodbye.